Russia just launched its biggest offensive against Ukraine in 2025. However, it hasn't gone according to plan. It's ended up in total failure, with Russia gaining practically no ground in the regions of Ukraine its troops are currently targeting. The country's goal appears to be to create a buffer zone that will allow it to attack deeper into the Sumy region. Right now, Russia has been stopped in its tracks by a brave Ukrainian defense. But the future may not be so clear due to a combination of problems in the Russian military and challenges that Ukraine may soon face in maintaining its defense. On April 9, the Moscow Times reported that Russia had launched a massive offensive against the Ukrainian regions of Sumy and Kharkiv just a couple of days before. That news came from the Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Syrsky, who says that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's March prediction that Ukraine would face a renewed assault has come true. I can say that the president is absolutely right, and this Russian offensive has actually already begun, Syrsky told reporters from the Ukrainian media outlet Left Bank. For several days now, nearly a week, we've been seeing almost a doubling of the number of enemy offensive actions in all major areas. This is far from the first time that Russian President Vladimir Putin has focused on the Sumy region. When he launched his supposed special military operation in February 2022, the Sumy Oblast was among the first that his forces occupied. By February 24, his troops occupied much of the oblast, though they never quite managed to make it to the capital city, which is also named Sumy. Instead, Ukraine completed a successful counter-offensive that resulted in the majority of Putin's forces withdrawing by April 2022. That didn't mean Sumy was safe. Russian soldiers rigged explosive and mines throughout the oblast. Still, it's been under Ukrainian control since April 2022, with Putin instead choosing to focus on eastern Ukraine, especially the Donbass region. Now, Russia's leader has turned his sights back to Sumy, and he's taking the assault very seriously. The War Zone, or TWZ, says that Putin has amassed tens of thousands of troops on the Sumy border. He's also launching an aerial blitz at the city that's designed to take out key infrastructure while terrorizing Sumy civilians. That blitz has already claimed dozens of lives. On April 13, Russian troops fired a missile at Sumy, followed up by sending its planes to drop glide bombs on the city. Those attacks followed shelling in the Kharkiv region that killed 4. The day prior, Russia unleashed another aerial assault that killed at least another 35 people in Sumy. What is Russia trying to achieve with these attacks? Beyond taking Sumy, several outlets suggest that Putin is attempting to create a buffer zone between his forces and the Ukrainian troops on the front line. That's the reason for the attacks given by the Moscow Times, which says that taking portions of Sumy will allow Putin to essentially create a blockade that prevents Ukrainian forces from re-invading the Kursk region. Russia has managed to push the majority of soldiers out of that Russian oblast during a multi-month campaign that started when Ukraine invaded the region in August 2024. Within weeks, Ukraine managed to capture almost 500 square miles of Russian territory, in addition to around 100 settlements in Kursk. The incident was a massive humiliation for Putin, along with a showcase of Ukraine's increasing willingness to attack Russia on its own turf. Ukraine had hoped to hold on to Kursk. Keeping that territory gave it leverage to use in peace talks, allowing it to offer Kursk in return for some of the territories Putin's forces have occupied in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Kursk is now back in Russian hands, and Putin is hitting Sumy with such ferocity because he wants to make sure that Ukraine can't carry out a similar invasion again. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, reinforces this thought that Putin wants to create a buffer zone. In its report on the new Russian offensive, the ISW says, the Russian military command is likely attempting to form a buffer zone along the international border in Sumy Oblast, although Russian commanders may intend to press further into Sumy Oblast and towards the city of Sumy in the future. In other words, the buffer would be a starting point for Putin. Once he has that in place, he can use it as a staging area for future assaults deeper into Sumy. If those assaults are successful and Russia manages to claim the Ukrainian Oblast, that brings Putin one step closer to Kyiv. And that would mean Russia is closer than ever to victory. At least, that's the plan. The number of clashes taking place in the Ukraine war suggests that Putin is hell-bent on turning that plan into a reality. BBC Ukraine reports evidence of intensified Russian assaults in March, when towards the beginning of the month, Putin's forces clashed with Ukraine's about 100 times per day. By the end of March, the number of clashes had risen to over 200. Putin's assaults have relented slightly moving into April, though the daily average for clashes is still between 150 and 160. Not all of those clashes took place near Sumy, but there was more than enough activity on the oblast border to create concern among Ukraine's troops. After Russia found success in Kursk, BBC Ukraine says it stepped up its attacks in Sumy to the point where it managed to penetrate about 4.3 miles into the oblast, creating a new front line that was about 15.5 miles wide. This penetration brings us to Putin's second goal, which is to encircle Sumy as best as he possibly can. That's according to an unnamed source in Ukraine's General Staff, who also points out that Ukraine is pushing to hold onto a bridgehead in the Kursk region to prevent that encirclement from happening. Ukraine has also launched limited operations in Belgorod, which is another Russian oblast that borders Ukraine, to force Russia to divert resources away from Sumy. All of this makes it sound like Russia is rampaging through the Sumy Oblast. However, the reality is much different for Putin. His Sumy offensive is failing to gain anywhere near the amount of ground he had hoped that it would. That's according to several sources, including the head of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, Lieutenant General Kirilo Budanov. He says that while Russian forces have amassed near the Sumy border, we don't observe enough Russian troops to capture Sumy city, which is around 15 miles from where Putin has gathered his forces. Instead, those Russian troops try to push our troops near the border. ISW reinforces that claim, adding that Russia attempted a push into Sumy on April 13. It says that the force managed to make very minimal advances, but they likely wouldn't be able to do much else. The force is simply too small to launch a full assault on Sumy without receiving significant reinforcement, ISW says. There's a similar situation happening in Kharkiv. Though more clashes are being recorded between Ukrainian and Russian troops, the lack of resources available to the Russian soldiers means they're not making it very far into Ukraine's territory. The same is happening in Donetsk, which is one of Putin's key focus areas during 2024. Budanov says Donetsk is a better situation for them, but still they don't have enough troops right now to advance past the administrative borders. They can only perform tactical movement. So Putin's forces aren't really advancing at all. At best, they're shifting positions to places Russia already occupies or Ukraine isn't actively defending. An ISW assessment published on April 13 demonstrates just how meager Russia's gains are. The highlights, or in Russia's case the lowlights, are shared by TWZ. It says that Russian forces are continuing to push against the few Ukrainian troops still stationed in Kursk as Putin attempts to completely retake the oblast. Those pushes haven't amounted to much, with no confirmed advances reported as Ukraine soldiers continue to hold the line. In Kharkiv, Russia forces managed a marginal advance northeast of Kharkiv city, though that's nothing to write home about. It's merely one of the tactical moves Budanov mentioned earlier rather than an actual advance. ISW reports that Ukraine managed to repel a pair of Russian sabotage groups along the international border Russia shares with Kharkiv during the week, along with destroying a Russian Starlink terminal in the oblast. Putin is trying to move his forces into position so they can conduct tube artillery strikes against Kharkiv. Right now, he's failing. The situation doesn't get any better for Putin in Sumy, where Russia's forces have stalled out on the oblast border after an initial 4-mile penetration. But what might be the worst news for Putin is that his occupation rate is slowing down almost everywhere. In Luhansk, which is predominantly under Russian control, Putin's troops made a minor advance towards Borova, but were stopped everywhere else. ISW says Ukraine made clever use of its drone units in these failed Russian assaults. Between April 4 and April 12, Ukraine repelled 5 of Russia's mechanized assaults with its drones, taking out several light armored vehicles in the process. In fact, Ukrainian drone and artillery strikes have prevented Russian forces from advancing more than 3.1 miles from Kotlia Rivka since May 2024. Moving on to Kherson, Russia attempted to conduct some offensive operations in the oblast, focusing specifically on Dnipro, but the story remained the same, no marked advancement. Attempted advances in Zaporizhzhia suffered the same fate. The only place where Putin's forces achieved any success at all was in Chasiv Yar, which is in the Donetsk region. Russia managed to advance slightly south of Chasiv Yar, though again the movements were marginal. They also came amidst Russian forces clashing with Ukrainian soldiers in Chasiv Yar, meaning the fighting is far from done and Russia may be pushed back again. Across the board, Russia is failing to advance, and this isn't a one-off situation taking place during the beginning of April. It's a pattern. Russia's advances into Ukraine have been faltering for several months. On April 10, Al Jazeera published the results of two analyses, one conducted by ISW and the other by the UK's Ministry of Defence, that demonstrated just how slow Russian advances have become over the last few months. The ISW's figures claim that Russia managed to take 165 square miles of Ukrainian territory in January, dropping to 137 square miles in February, then down again to just 78 square miles for the entire month of March. The Ministry of Defence figures make for even worse reading for Putin. They say Russia only managed to claim 126 square miles of Ukraine in January. February saw that number drop to 76 square miles, 2 square miles lower than the ISW estimate for March, with the Ministry of Defence claiming Russia only managed to claim 55 square miles a month later. This slowdown has occurred even though Russia has been adding between 120,000 and 130,000 soldiers per year to its forces in Ukraine, with Sursky stating that there are now 623,000 soldiers fighting for Russia on his country's territory. It's also worth noting that the supposedly failed Ukrainian counter-offensive of 2023 retook 7,722 square miles from Putin. According to Al Jazeera, Russia has failed to retake any of that territory in the nearly 2 years since. And if its rate of advance stays at the same levels as ISW and the Ministry of Defence claim they are, that seemingly small chunk of territory would take between 8.25 and 11.7 years to reclaim. Therein lies the problem for Putin. If retaking the territory he lost to Ukraine in 2023 could take up to 11.7 years, what does that mean for the rest of the country? Do the math. Ukraine is about 233,100 square miles, of which Russia controls approximately 20%. That leaves almost 186,500 square miles left for Russia to occupy. Assuming the same rate of advance it had in March across the ISW and Ministry of Defence figures, it would take Russia anywhere between 199 and 282 years to take all of Ukraine. Of course, it will be much lower if Putin can take Sumy and use it as a springboard to reach Kyiv, but even then, Sumy is 9,202 square miles. Assuming the ISW's 78 square miles per month capture rate, that will still amount to 9.83 years, and that's assuming Russia focuses all of its efforts on the oblast at the expense of every other region in Ukraine. That's a lot of calculating to essentially say that Russia's invasion is practically at a standstill, which leads to an obvious question. Why is Russia failing to advance both in Sumy and elsewhere in Ukraine? A lot of it comes down to people and resources, as Budanov explained. That might seem like a strange statement to make, given Sursky's claims that there are over 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine, but there are a few important points to make in that respect. It's not necessarily about the amount of soldiers Putin has, it's where they're located. Taking Sumy as an example, the majority of the troops Putin has amassed on the Sumy Oblast border have already spent months fighting against Ukraine in Kursk. There may be a few thousand that have arrived from other locations, but the majority of that force is already exhausted, both physically and in terms of the equipment it has available. Again, the numbers prove that point. When Putin started his Kursk counter-offensive, he amassed a fighting force of around 50,000 soldiers, including over 10,000 he'd gained from North Korea. Guess how many of those soldiers remain? Practically none of them, according to Ukraine. It says that Russia suffered over 50,000 casualties during its multi-month campaign to retake Kursk, forcing Putin to draw from reserves in the region to supplement his original force. The soldiers attempting to amass near Sumy are a mismatch of those reserves, the few survivors from the original 50,000 troops, and the poorly trained soldiers Putin typically sends to border regions. Those types of troops are little more than cannon fodder for Putin. They struggle to put together any offensives that don't involve overwhelming their enemy with sheer numbers, and those numbers are falling rapidly. Putin is also struggling to send reinforcements to Sumy because his forces are tied up in battles elsewhere, in addition to now having to focus on Belgorod given Ukraine's operations in that oblast. Russia is locked into a vicious cycle. It launches offensives that kill thousands of its more experienced soldiers. Those troops are replaced by reserves, mercenaries, and less experienced soldiers who are more likely to be killed by Ukraine. They're replaced by more of the same, and so on, which weakens the impact Russia's offensive have in Ukraine. Just expand the view of Russia's 2025 casualty rate to see that. According to Pravda, Russia has suffered 138,000 casualties between January 1st and April 14. That amounts to around 40,000 losses per month, which are similar to the figures seen during the last months of 2024 when Russia's assaults on Donetsk were at their most intense. Losing over 100,000 soldiers for a couple of hundred square miles of Ukrainian territory is a terrible return for Putin, and what's not being seen in Sumy is a microcosm of a much larger problem for Russia's leader. He doesn't have the manpower he needs to sustain his assaults. Or, more accurately, he has the bodies, but his soldiers don't have the skills or experience to do much more than die for his cause while making such tiny gains that the Ukraine war is practically at a standstill. Compounding this problem is that the less skilled and exhausted soldiers Putin is deploying in regions like Sumy don't have the equipment they need. As ISW points out, Russia's defense industrial base can't churn out new tanks, artillery and armored vehicles or restore the Soviet-era stockpiles Russia still has at a fast enough rate to deal with the churn caused by Putin's offensives. If Russia attempts to maintain the same pace it has now, it'll have burned through almost everything it has by around the end of the year or sometime in 2026, leaving it with even more weakened fighting forces. Think about what that means in the context of Russia's faltering advances in Sumy and elsewhere. Either Putin has to slow his attacks down, which means fewer advances, or he maintains the same attack rate as he has now, which still yields minimal results but also spells doom for his already exhausted soldiers later on down the line. Does all of this mean a Ukrainian victory has become inevitable? Not necessarily. A lot rides on Ukraine's relationship with the United States, which has switched to become more antagonistic again in recent days. TWZ notes that there are hints of this antagonism in the new minerals deal the US has presented to Ukraine. Should Zelensky accept that deal, he'd have to hand over 100% of the profits Ukraine minerals and rare earth industries generate to the US until Ukraine pays back the military aid it's received from the country so far. US President Donald Trump's rhetoric has also switched back to blaming Zelensky for the war that Russia started. Ukraine's president says his country is willing to spend between $30 billion and $50 billion on US weapons in a move that seems designed to show Trump that Ukraine doesn't want to rely on handouts. That suggestion doesn't seem to have worked, based on Trump's comments to reporters in the White House on April 15 about Zelensky's request to buy US weapons.
He's always looking to purchase missiles, you know. He's against, listen, when you start a war, you got to know that you can win the war, right? You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people give you some missiles.
That turnaround by Trump could spell issues for Ukraine in the future. It suggests the possibility that the US could once again suspend military aid to Ukraine, especially given that Trump now seems unwilling to accept payment for the weapons it provides. And though the rest of Ukraine's partners pledged donations totaling nearly $24 billion during last week's meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, that may not be enough to ensure Ukraine can sustain its defense without US help. So the Ukraine war is at a strange point. Right now, Russia appears to have been weakened to the point where it can't make any advances despite having a casualty rate well above 1,000 soldiers per day. That's obvious in Sumy, where every Russian offensive is being shot down. But Ukraine may struggle to take advantage of this weakness now that the roller coaster that is its relationship with the United States seems to be heading into a trough. The only thing for sure is that Russia's biggest offensive of 2025 so far has completely and utterly failed. Whether the same could be said about Putin's upcoming offensives is anybody's guess. But what do you think about what Ukraine has achieved by holding off Russia in Sumy and elsewhere? Is it a sign that Putin's forces are weakening? How do you see the future of the Ukraine war going from here? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date commentary on the latest developments in Ukraine. We're an independent source of news and information about global conflicts and very much appreciate your support.